In the heart of Hays County, Texas, lies a clear, calm pool of water. It's undeniably beautiful, and it's one of the most dangerous diving spots in the entire world. These serene waters are a gateway to deep, sunken caves, and it is here that at least 12 people, including experienced divers, have lost their lives. But what makes this seemingly idyllic spot so dangerous? And what is it about those crystal clear waters that draws people in? Jacob's Well, despite what the name implies, is not a well at all. It's actually an artesian spring, an underground cave system 140 feet deep and over 4,300 feet in length. This natural phenomenon, the second largest fully submerged cave in Texas, has existed for untold millennia, though the first written mention of it came from Jacob de Cova back in the 19th century. Because of this, some believe the spring was named after him. The water that feeds the deceptively calm spring comes from an underground reservoir known as the Trinity Aquifer, which keeps the water at an ideal 68 degrees Fahrenheit or 20 degrees Celsius all year round. Since the Lone Star State is known for its scorching summers, it's hardly surprising that many people flock to Jacob's Well in the summer months. Just beyond the surface of this oasis lurks a deep mystery, an irresistible siren song to many would-be explorers. And so, in order to understand why it is so easy to run into trouble in Jacob's Well, you need to know how the cave structure is shaped. In the first part of the caves, which is visible from the surface, features a vertical shaft reaching 25 feet down, culminating in a false bottom. Many people have safely dived their way down to this point before looking back up and letting the aquifer's outflow help them back toward the blue sky above the water surface. If you test this false bottom, however, you can find a hidden chamber with a low ceiling that leads on at a downward angle for 75 feet. At the end of the chute is a narrow crawl space that connects to a narrow room with a high ceiling containing an air pocket. If you reach this spot, then a tight squeeze is all that separates you from an enticing area known as the Fourth Passage. The passage to this fourth chamber had already claimed numerous lives, and, as we will see, it was still hungry for more. 20-year-old Kent Morpin wasn't worried about Jacob's Well's dangerous reputation. He was an experienced diver, working as assistant instructor at a Pasadena dive shop, and he was aware of the risk. He also knew that at least 4 others had lost their lives trying to explore the Fourth Passage, but Kent believed that he and his friend, 21-year-old Mark Brasher, knew what they were doing. Kent and Mark entered Jacob's Well shortly after midnight on September the 9th, 1979. Part of a larger group of around 20. They had arrived to the area late, but while the others set up camp, the 2 young men, along with a few others, decided that they just couldn't resist a late-night dive. Mark and Kent had not shared their plans of attempting this passage with the other divers in the group, so after they all made their way down to the false bottom, navigating through the first chamber with relative ease as planned, the other divers were surprised to find the 2 young men heading for the dangerous Fourth Passage, despite not having safety lines or backup flashlights. Kent, then Mark, took off their tanks to fit through the 18-inch wide entrance and slipped into the passage. Joe Moyer, another diver in the group, watched in horror as Mark vanished into the tunnel. He knew that Kent and Mark's steel tanks held less air than his aluminium one, and considering he was beginning to indicate that it was time to make his way back to the surface, he knew this spelled trouble for the reckless young men. Joe tried to get Mark's attention, shining and waving his flashlight. When that didn't work, he began to hit his tank with his knife. hoping that the sound would echo in the water. But he received no reply, and the two young men were now out of sight. Frustrated and out of options, Joe did the only thing he still could. He propped up his flashlight and left it shining into the passage. He held on to the faint hope that he would help Kent and Mark find their way out. Joe swam back up. As he reached the surface, an eerie sight greeted him. The normally crystal clear water had turned an opaque brown. Joe's heart sank. This silty water could only mean one of two things. Either Kent and Mark had begun to panic, which stirred up the silt in the passage, or worse, they had been hit by a gravel slide. Regardless of which it was, Joe knew Kent and Mark were gone. The chances of surviving either of these scenarios was virtually none. About an hour later, and miles away, a former Navy diver and master scuba instructor named Dibble was sound asleep when his phone began to ring. Fellow diver and police officer Paul Battaglia had called to deliver the bad news and ask for help. But the divers that would once more descend Jacob's world to look for the two young men knew that they weren't undertaking a rescue mission. Tragically, this was a body recovery. It was still dark when the rescue team arrived. The other members of Kent and Mark's diving group had already made several desperate attempts to locate them, all without success. One of the group's members had completed 290-minute dives back-to-back and told Don that he had seen Kent and Mark's bodies trapped beneath the gravel slide. At that, Don's suspicions were confirmed. The two men couldn't survive a slide like that, especially without sufficient oxygen in their tanks. Given the situation, Don was reluctant to dive before the sun rose. So, two other divers went ahead to assess the situation. They couldn't see either Kent or Mark, but they did see that the passage had become almost completely blocked with gravel. Arriving back at the surface, they expressed their concerns about the risk of a gravel slide, trapping whoever went next to the cave floors. On this advice, the decision was made to assemble a larger team and return in the daylight with more equipment. The group returned at 10 a.m. The next morning, and again 2 divers went down to assess the situation. Eventually, those 2 divers reached the passage that had been blocked with gravel and attempted to push the gravel back through the passage to create a wide enough opening for them to fit through. It didn't work. In fact, it just made things worse. Exasperated, the divers returned to the surface and reported what they found. It was at this point that Don decided to go down himself. He squeezed into his wetsuit, strapped on his gear, and, accompanied by Game Warden Calvin Turner, began the descent for themselves. The 2 men made their way down carefully, leaving 2 extra tanks along the way. At last, they reached the opening that Kent and Mark had disappeared through. Sadly, it was clear that no one else was getting through there. While they thought through their next move, Don checked how much air he had left in his tank. At the depth he'd reached, he had about 10 minutes remaining. He decided to risk it. Slowly, Don stuck his head and shoulders through the narrow opening that led to the 4th passage. In one hand, he held the safety line that tethered him to the surface, and in the other, a flashlight. For a moment, Don couldn't see anything but gravel. Then, before he could react at all, the earth began to move. Suddenly, both of his arms were trapped by the weight of another gravel slide, small rocks flowing around and over him, making it impossible for him to signal to Calvin, still treading water behind him. Visibility went down to near zero. All he could see was the swirling silt and splintering gravel, gathering closer and closer. Don panicked. He couldn't stop his breathing from intensifying as he tried to free himself. His air was running out. He couldn't move, couldn't get free, couldn't even see to try. Don came to the chilling realization that he was about to die. As the gravel continued to pour in, it seemed to bring with it a feeling of cold resignation. He was trapped. There was no moving forward and no going back. Don reasoned that since he was already suffocating, it might be better to try something desperate. He spat out his regulator and started to drink the water surrounding him. His body, in a last-ditch effort at self-preservation, began thrashing violently to free itself. Miraculously, it worked, and Don came free. A few seconds later, he began to regain his bearings, peering through his flooded mask into the murky water. Don was relieved, to say the least, when he saw Calvin passing him the spare tank's regulator. But Don's troubles were far from over. His desperate inhale from the spare tank caused some of the air to go into his stomach, rather than his lung. As he and Calvin slowly made their way back up, that trapped air began to expand. It stretched the lining of his stomach, causing Don immense pain. Finally, as they approached the surface, it could stretch no more. The trapped air burst a hole in Don's stomach. After an agonizing extraction from the water, Don was rushed to Brooke Army Medical Center, where he remained in excruciating pain for hours before they discovered the rupture and rushed him to the operating room. But while Don recovered from surgery, the search for Kent and Mark continued. Tragically, despite best efforts from some of the top experts in the field, they were unsuccessful. 12 days after they've gone missing, the search was called off. Jacob's well had swallowed the two young men, and it was intent on keeping them out of everyone's reach. Once Don had recovered, he went back to Jacob's well with a group of other divers and cemented a metal grate over the lower section of the cave system. They wanted to make sure that what happened to Kent and Mark didn't happen again. It would be decades before the world would release its two victims. Most of Mark's remains were discovered 10 years after the incident. But it wasn't until the year 2000, 21 years later, that Kent's remains were found as a part of a routine mapping dive. On the same dive, the mapping crew found that the gates cemented in place by Don Dibble had been washed away, and the mysterious fourth chamber beckoned once more. Now, Jacob's well remained open to the public, though water access requires a permit. So, if the tales of terrible things happening in the dark, flooded caverns of Jacob's well haven't scared you away, and you're an experienced diver, you can still apply to see the fourth chamber for yourself. But keep in mind, you may never see the surface again. This has been Gripping Horror. I hope to see you in the next one.